Joining us now from London to discuss this is Henry Newman. He's director of the think tank Open Europe. He's also a former advisor to pro-Brexit politician Michael Gove. Henry, good morning to you. We appreciate you joining us. Good morning. Well, was anyone expecting the Rock of Gibraltar to be a possible stumbling block to this agreement coming before EU leaders on Sunday?
Well, I don't think this is a total surprise. We saw some sort of noises out of Spain earlier in the process, and Spain insisted that it would have a veto over the final negotiations of the future trade deal over the matter of Gibraltar. And of course, that was a little bit of politicking, really, because ultimately every country has a veto because the trade deal, the future, will require unanimous agreement by all EU members. But clearly, the new Spanish Prime Minister has been in post now for just around half a year, and he clearly feels that this is an important opportunity to sort of stake his claim loudly as a defender of Spanish interests. So I think it's more about the politics than the substance, but of course politics can get in the way of substance.
Absolutely. So the summit on Sunday, if the Spain issue is resolved, do you think EU leaders will approve? And if so, what then?
Well, I suspect we'll get to the summit on Sunday. There'll be some sort of side arrangement on Gibraltar. But then the real challenge for the Prime Minister comes back in London when she tries to introduce this deal on the floor of the House of Commons. And it just seems overwhelmingly likely that MPs will not accept this from her own party. That the opposition, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and others are also implacably opposed at this point. So she may well come back with a deal, but then be unable to get it through the Commons. And of course, there's no point having a deal that you can agree in Brussels at a summit if it doesn't work in Westminster. We saw some of that with David Cameron's renegotiation of the EU back in 2016, where he got a deal that he was quite happy with on the renegotiation, tried to bring it back to Westminster, and it completely fell apart. So I'm sure that EU leaders and the UK government, people I speak to in Downing Street, they're very reluctant to reopen the deal, but they may have to because of the very serious concerns, particularly around this insurance policy for Northern Ireland, the so-called backstop, that are very deeply held by both the Conservatives and their partners in government, the DUP, the Ulster Unionists.
Right, and other citizens are worried about the availability of medicine with Brexit and of course the economy. But I want to ask you, how do you see the future of the UK if she gets this through?
Well, I think if she gets the deal through, I think there'll be a huge sigh of relief because actually we'll then have a standstill transition where, although we'll be technically out of the European Union, everything will stay the same. And that will give the UK the opportunity to start negotiating a future relationship. But we don't have that clarity yet. There are many different possible outcomes, including, of course, the default, which is that the clock ticks out, the sand runs out of the timer, and we leave without any deal at all. Now, some, of course, are very worried about that, but we've done some work at my think tank, and we broadly feel that over the medium term, the effects on the UK economy will be relatively limited, particularly if the government took unilateral action to mitigate that by, for example, lowering tariffs and doing some deregulation on our openness to foreign investment. But the actual moment of no deal could be very disruptive for both sides on things like aviation. You were referring to medicines before. So it would depend on what actions the UK and the EU together were willing to take to mitigate those effects.
Right, a no deal just sounds like a ominous future because no one would know what would that lead to. We know that many in Parliament are against her on this, what she has delivered. What are the reasons that it is so disliked?
Sure. Well, I think the problem is that the Prime Minister, has never been able to really explain that actually Brexit will require compromise. The country was split 52-48. You have to negotiate something that needs to be agreed in Brussels, where, of course, the 27, Brussels itself and the Commission have their own interests. And then she has to try and deliver it through a very divided Parliament where opinions have really hardened and become more polarised over the past 2 years. So she hasn't been able to explain that compromise and trade-off is required. And particularly around this question of Northern Ireland, there's a huge amount of well, I think, genuine concern, because the current deal that's on the table would mean that, for Northern Ireland in particular, the EU would be able to introduce new rules and regulations that would bind Northern Ireland, potentially in perpetuity, without any ability of the people in Northern Ireland to either influence those rules or say no to them. So in constitutional terms, that's very problematic. And unless we can find a clear way through that, I think the Northern Irish Party, the DUP, which she relies on for her government, will continue to oppose this very, very strongly. So I hope that the government does look at that, because we've got to find a deal that works for both communities in Northern Ireland. The nationalists, their interests have been protected by the Irish government sitting around the table in Brussels and insisting that they got this insurance policy, the backstop. But the concerns of the unionist community haven't been met, and they're profoundly worried by the current deal.
It's amazing how many people are watching Brexit because it is so complex and the stakes are high. We'll continue to watch it closely. Thank you so much for your insights, Henry Newman, for us. Thanks, Henry.